a guy named James, he had built an interesting service called A Street Near You, which was, he had taken a data set. He came from the background of working in museums, and they found a data set of the addresses and photos of people who had died in World War I. So kind of millions of people in the UK millions of soldiers who have died. And he took that data set and all he did was, it was on index cards, physical index cards, and they digitized it and geocoded all the addresses, and then it created literally a mashup, as you say, like showing that on a Google map.
Welcome to another episode of the Mapscaping Podcast. My name is Daniel, and this is a podcast for the geospatial community. So today on the show, I'm lucky enough to be talking to one of the founding members of a community called Geomob. So without giving too much away, I can say that Geomob is it's a community of people that are very broadly interested in geospatial. But before we get into the interview, I would like to take a few seconds here just to thank the sponsors of this podcast. This podcast is sponsored by a company called HiveMapper, and this is a company that lets you upload video footage to their platform, and they automatically convert it into 3D geospatial data. So if you're a regular listener of this podcast, you will have heard me say that a few times before, but what I haven't said before is, thanks to their support, we are reaching thousands of people and we're spreading the word about geospatial, and for that I am truly grateful. Okay, here is the interview. Hey Ed, welcome back to the podcast, and I say welcome back because you've been here before. The first time you came along, you talked a little bit about geocoding and translating between machines and humans, and I remember when you contacted me and said, hey, I'd like to talk about this, and I think it would make an interesting topic. I remember thinking, okay, geocoding, I think we all get what it is, but it very quickly became very obvious to me that you are someone who thinks very deeply about the geospatial industry, and I really enjoyed that conversation. And because I've talked to you before, I'd like to, this is going to be my first attempt at actually introducing someone. So for the audience, to give you a little bit of background, Ed runs an open cage data, which is a geocoding service. He's also invested in a few different geo startups, and he is, I guess you could call you the founder of something called Geomob. It's a really interesting movement, and you're creating a really interesting community. So I'd like to try and tell the listeners what's happening with Geomob, what is it, how do you get involved, and then perhaps try and draw some parallels to what's happening in the wider geospatial community. So welcome again, Ed.
Yeah, thanks for having me back. Geomob, so first of all, it's not entirely correct. I was not the founder of Geomob, but I've been running it for about 10 years. So the original founder was a guy named Chris Osborne, and then he moved and he wasn't able to keep running it. So then we took it over. Geomob is a meetup that we have every couple of months, so usually about once a quarter. And we started it in London, and we've been running it in London for about 10 years. And since then, we've now expanded to a few other cities. We're now in 4 cities and hopefully growing to a few more. The thing that's different about this meetup is it's not a technical meetup. It's not a startup event. It's not a pitch event or anything like that. The only purpose of Geomob is to bring together people who are doing interesting things in the geospace in whatever way, shape, or form, and then we have fun. And we learn a little bit about what they're doing, and we hear some talks, and then we meet up and have some beers, and we exchange information, and people get to meet each other. We try to summarize it kind of in our tagline, which is Geoinnovation for fun or profit. So it could be startups, it could be big companies, it could be people from academia, it could be hobbyists. So we have a lot of people kind of from the OpenStreetMap community and those types of groups. Or it could just be people who are interested in maps or geo who happen to come along. So as I said, we do it about once a quarter. It varies slightly. It's not a very strict or rigorous schedule. Depending on the city, we have anywhere between I think the biggest one we've ever has maybe 100 people. But normal is, let's say, 50, 75 or so. In some of the newer cities, of course, it's still a little smaller. And we've been doing it for about 10 years. So in that regard, it gives us a chance to kind of look back over where the industry has been and how it's been evolving and what the trends are and things like that.
I think what I find really interesting about Geomob, the idea of it and the community that you're building around this concept, is that everyone. It's everyone that's interested in geo or interested in solving a problem that has something to do with geospatial, that has something to do with maps. And I think that this is what we're seeing out in the industry as well. We're not just seeing the classically trained geographers, the geospatial specialists, and the remote sensing people involved in the industry anymore. These are people that are just showing up and they're solving problems, and they're seeing interesting ways to do what we called mashups back in the day, where they are just curating a whole bunch of data or putting together different services in a way that solves a problem in the geospatial world.
Wow, I don't think I've heard the word mashup in at least 5 years. That's kind of a weird throwback. But yeah, what you say is absolutely correct. So we definitely have people with the kind of hardcore GIS background and work at, let's say, the national mapping agencies in the UK, the Ordnance Survey, or here in Barcelona, which is another city, we have the Catalan mapping agency. Those people definitely come and contribute and often give talks. But a big part of the audience is just people who don't really self-identify necessarily as being geo developers, but much more is just they're building a service or a product or whatever that happens to have a geo aspect, and so they start, they come along and tell us about that and learn and eat from the others and pick up some tips and tricks. It really is kind of a very broad spectrum. I guess should tell you a little bit about kind of how we structured the event. Basically, it's in the evenings. We have, depending on how many people volunteer to speak, anywhere between 4 and 6 different speakers. Each speaker gets 10 to 15 minutes to present their topic. And I really try to be selective. There's one qualification I try to have in terms of who gets to speak, and that is they should be a doer. Okay, so that maybe they're a software developer, maybe they're a product manager, maybe they're the founder of a geo startup in some way. But really, I want the people who are actually building and creating the things, not kind of marketing PR people. Those talks, we have about an hour and a half of talks, and then afterwards we typically go to a nearby pub, both of those sides of the event are very important. On the one hand, the talks where we learn about new things, but then the socializing aspect where people get to mix and mingle, and ask very detailed questions of the speakers if they found it interesting, and that's what kind of really creates the community. And we found that's quite important also that we physically go kind of to another venue and a more social venue, because then it kind of breaks down the barriers in the audience. So sometimes some of the speakers, we have had some big names, or people from big brands, and then the audience you might have a first year student or something. But because it then is in kind of more of a social interaction, it's much easier for people to kind of comment and learn and share ideas, and that's really what we're trying to do. So what we're trying to stimulate.
Okay, so we've got this community, this very broad community of people that are interested in geo in some way, shape, or form. And I think it's really important to note that they're all makers. They're all people that are actually doing things, at least the presenters. So what kind of projects do you see them working on? Do you see any trends in this community?
A lot of trends, actually. It varies slightly by city. So, as I said, we're in 4 cities now. The original one being London, which obviously it's a huge city and it has a huge thriving tech community. So, there are a lot of startups because they're trying to get the word out about their service. The other cities, maybe it's a kind of more diverse mix. We often have the event at different universities, so we get people from academia. Um, uh, but really, it's as broad a mix as possible. Anyone who wants to volunteer. In terms of trends, I guess having done it now for 10 years, there are a lot of things that we see. So one big trend, the mega trend, is that the barriers to entry to doing amazing things have fallen significantly. And actually, when we started Geomob in London, a big component was all the people. That's where OpenStreetMap started 15 years ago, and we saw a lot of people come from that kind of original OpenStreetMap group. And one of their main motivations of creating OpenStreetMap was just getting access to data. It was cost prohibitive for people to get good geodata to do things, and now that's not the case at all. I mean, now the problem is the other way around. There's too much data, so there's more and more value in kind of curation rather than creation of data. I guess obviously another big trend is, of course, the rise of mobile. Everyone now has a device all the time with them that knows where they are, and so that opens up all kinds of possibilities. Um, I guess, yeah, the trend that you kind of alluded to at the beginning, that we have more and more people who don't come from a GIS background in any way. They don't have any kind of formal geo training. They don't self-identify as being GIS people or geo people. They're just kind of software developers, or in many cases they're just like, oh, I have an idea or a vision for a project or a product, and it turns out I need geo to do that. And yeah, because of mobile now, more and more products and projects have a geo aspect. Interesting, more and more niche tools coming about. So whereas people previously might have taken a broader approach and say, I'm going to build this big, amazing thing that's going to change the world. Um, we still have those kinds of people, but now you also see more and more people who just take a much more pragmatic approach and say, oh, I built this little service that does X. It still solves this niche need. People have this problem. I'm going to charge this amount of money to help them solve this problem. So we see businesses like that. But really, it's a broad spectrum. I mean, we've had startups all the way through to artists. Many of the projects that come in, not many, but some of the projects, and there's no business model behind it at all. It's just someone says, "Here's a cool idea I had," and the technology now makes it possible. So here's what I want to do. We've had people, and we've been fortunate to have people from actual people who draw maps, like physically by hand, still draw maps and come in and they just talk about how they do that and the challenges of doing that especially in an increasingly digital world. So really, it's the broadest possible spectrum of anyone doing anything interesting in geo.
I'm really glad you mentioned that there's room for non-programmers as well, for non-technical people, and that you have artists showing up and saying, "Hey, I'm physically drawing a map. This is not scalable. It's probably not repeatable. This is a one of a kind thing, and you don't need to be technical to do this, or perhaps even to appreciate it." So that's really cool that side of it is also being represented. Now, when you look at this broad spectrum of people and projects and ideas, and you've already sort of identified a few of the trends you see at Geomob itself. Do you see those trends being reflected in the broader geospatial industry?
I think so. In that, the tooling around geo, whether it's a service like Google Maps or whether it's the availability of data through something like OpenStreetMap, um, you know, it's just gotten so much easier to build things, to build, and I don't mean just like kind of quick little prototypes. I mean actually robust, scalable, usable, impressive tools and services. All of the software. I'm thinking of projects here like Leaflet or Open Layers that make it so much easier to do things with maps on websites and in apps. The ability to get the user's location from a mobile application. All of that has just made things so much simpler. But then that opens an interesting challenge, right? That in that previously the challenge was how do I get the data? Now then you get the data. Then you say, well, how do I build it? Okay, so now it's simpler and simpler to build it. And now increasingly the challenge becomes how do I, just because I build it, how do I get people to use it? And how do I make the world aware of my amazing new thing? And that challenge remains difficult. So, but that's what keeps it exciting. I mean, we still. I should say, not all of those problems. It has gotten simpler, but that doesn't mean everything is simple. We had a talk a couple weeks ago from a guy from a gaming background, and he has his company that just built a virtual reality exact replica of all of Manhattan. Getting all the building shapes and profiles from OpenStreetMap and things like that. And, a real technical challenge to do this to a massive amount of data, and they're trying to render it super quickly so that and I mean, he showed us examples where it's like you're literally walking around Manhattan as you look through these kind of virtual reality goggles. Very cool. Very cool. I mean, so there are definitely still people pushing the technical forefront of what's possible. But likewise, now you also see more and more people where the challenge is how do I motivate people to use the service? How do I get people to share the service? How do I tap into emotional desires and get people to to really become passionate about a service.
I think you're touching on a really interesting point there, because I think in a world where everyone can, then everyone will. And we see this all the time in social media. And then if everybody is doing it, this makes for a very noisy world.
Absolutely correct. Yeah.
So then the next question is, how do I reach those people? How do I reach my people? How do I find them? How do I tell them what I've built? How do you see people solving that problem?
Um, well, I mean, there's no single solution, right? It's a combination of many things. But I will say this: I said there's always space for creativity, and people are coming up with clever new things all the time. Um, we had a talk actually 2 weeks ago in London at our last London event, and the guy who at the end he was kind of voted best speaker. We kind of do an informal, by show of hands, best speaker. And he, a guy named James, he had built an interesting service called a Street Near You, which was he had taken a data set. He came from the background of working in museums, and they found a data set of the addresses and photos of people who had died in World War One. So kind of millions of people in the UK who had millions of soldiers who had died. And he took that data set and all he did was it was on index cards, physical index cards, and they digitized it and geocoded all the addresses, and then it created literally a mashup, as you say, like showing that on a Google map. And so there was nothing really technically that complex or interesting about this service, but it really succeeded in tapping into an emotional current. He did this right around kind of the 100th anniversary of the end of World War One, and he was very adept at using social media to get it out there. And one thing it really reminded me of is people are still, even though we live in a globalized society, and when something happens on the other side of the world, you hear about it instantly. But people are still very interested in what's happening near them, and that's something that where location-based services have a key role to play. So with his mashup, you could literally type in your address in the UK and see, okay, on my street, how many soldiers were there that died in World War One, and you could see pictures of them, and so very emotional. And we've actually had many talks over the years of these kind of historic things where you can visualize and go back. And we have a talk coming up in Barcelona in January. I'm really looking forward to this guy's talk, where they kind of took old photos of Barcelona, of the old city from the 1890s and things. And I'm not sure exactly how they did this, but through different rendering techniques, they kind of created a Google Street View of the old city of Barcelona using these photos. And it's kind of like it gives you the effect that you can kind of walk through the city. Really cool. Really, really cool. So that's what I mean, where there's still a lot of room for creativity. And the people who are doing well are the people who are understanding what data is now available, how to curate that, how to simplify it, and how to apply it to the new technologies in a way that makes it easily digestible for the relevant audience. And then how do you motivate that relevant audience to share it with their peers? So that was with this Street Near You. That was one thing. That was why it exploded, because people would kind of check out their own street or check out their parents' house or whatever, and then they would, immediately mail it to someone or post it in social media, and it just really exploded and really captured the public imagination.
I think you made some really interesting observations there, and of course, you mentioned Tobler's first law of geography. Things that all things are related, but near things are more related than distant things, and that would definitely tie in nicely with that observation that people are really interested in what's happening around them, what's local to them, what happened on my street, and also that observation that if you build it, they won't come. You need to do something else, and tapping into that emotional side of it through geospatial, through space, through that relevance, because this thing happened near me. I wonder if we're going to see more services like that in the future, as opposed to scaling up. We're all talking about scale. How can we do this at a global scale? Perhaps we're going to shrink down again and say, well, how can we do this at a very local scale and provide something that's really relevant to the users?
Well, I think that very well could be this case, because there's an adage in product managing: if you're making something for everyone, you're making it for no one, right? It's much better to have the 1,000 people who love your product than to have the 100,000 people who are kind of okay, it's nice. kind of ambivalent about it. And so maybe obviously local geography is a way to do that. And over the years we've had several. Trying to think of some other services along that line. We had right when they first launched, we had City Mapper, which is a successful startup, well-known brand now in many cities. But it was originally designed as a tool to, as anyone who's ever lived in London knows, one of the great weaknesses of the city is that it's a huge pain in the ass to get around. And so City Mapper, their original premise was just we help you get around London, and we combine all the different transport services. And I mean, it sounds like a trivial thing of like, how do I get from A to B? But because they really adapted it to the nuances of London, it exploded. It exploded, and so there's definitely room for those kind of very niche products. I would say, yeah.
Through your involvement with these startups that you've invested in, the startups that you've created yourself, and Geomob, and you've been in the industry for a while now. When you look around, what kind of big opportunities do you see out there at the moment?
Oh, well, this idea of building niche services I don't mean niche, and as we discussed before, like concentrating on one city, but like targeting one very specific piece of the value chain and executing on that very well. That's a little bit what we're trying to do with OpenGH. With our geocoding service, we don't do maps, we don't do routing, we don't do any of that. We do geocoding, and that's it. And so there are more and more companies like that who find their little niche and become the absolute experts in that. I think that's there's always going to be an opportunity for that. I don't think what other kind of services we kind of see. I don't know. I mean, as I said, there's always room for creativity. There's always room for people who just, the old adage is true: find a problem and then solve it. And so, another one of the most memorable talks, and in some ways one of the most meaningful talks we've had at Geomob over the last couple of years. In the UK, there's a service, and this was one guy's idea. And again, his background was as a designer, not as a software developer, as a GIS person. It's a company or a service called Proxy Address. So in the UK, a big challenge that people have is that everywhere you go, every official interaction you have, like let's say you want to open a bank account or whatever, first thing they ask is, can you provide your address and proof of address? Okay, so the problem is if you're homeless and you don't have an address, so then that means you can't get a bank account because you don't have a bank account. You can't get an apartment because you can't get a job because so you kind of fall out of a lot of services because you don't have this address. And it becomes unnecessarily difficult for you to try to get back into society. And so what he did is said, look, we actually have, why don't we create kind of fake addresses for people, a so-called proxy address, where it will look just like a real address. The postal service will treat it as a real address, then it will know, however, to route that mail kind of to the local council or whatever. And in this way, these people will be able to get their foot back on the ladder and not fall out of the system, which obviously then becomes, once you're out of the system, it's hugely difficult to get back into it and much more expensive. And so really amazing of how this guy took this simple idea of, how can we find unused addresses? So as an example, in many cities, people, there's a superstition against the number 13. So many streets won't have a house 13. So what if we just, in streets that don't have a house 13, we could create a house 13, a database entry for the house 13, and a homeless person can use that as their address. And so really clever kind of a way of seeing a problem and thinking of like, okay, how do we solve this with the tools that we have currently? And the thing I really liked about this is it wasn't, this guy was really approaching the problem from the design of the whole problem. If you had just approached this with like a committee and a team of product managers, you might say, okay, well, let's go to the bank and we can assign this guy some kind of code and we can get the banks to recognize that code. And it's going to require so much change and it's going to be so hard to implement. And so instead, what he said is like, the existing systems out there all expect an address. So how do we give this guy something that is like an address? And that way he can stay in the existing system rather than trying to reinvent everything. Really eye-opening, really cool.
Yeah, and it's almost a little bit scary that we have to sort of spoof a location so this person can get back into the system. So we need a physical address that it's actually tied to a location. You have to have a house or a physical address I can send this thing to. Otherwise, you're not welcome in our system. I think that's really eye-opening and interesting in itself, especially in such a digital world. And for me, it really highlights the fact that those interfaces between the physical and the digital, we've got a long way to go to build all the bridges across there that we actually need.
Absolutely correct. I mean, this is the reason that stuck out as one of my favorite talks over the years wasn't, I mean, obviously it's a great cause and he's helping people, but exactly what you say is like, it really causes you to reflect on like, are we doing this all wrong? Like, why are we forcing people to have a physical ad? It really causes you to question some of the fundamental assumptions of your thinking about geography. And those are kind of the best talks. And actually, that's one of the points. Having done this now for 10 years, it's often very surprising. So people volunteer for the talk, and they give me kind of like the title of the talk, and oftentimes I don't know the people well or whatever, and I just say, okay, great, you're on it this day, and ahead of time, it's almost impossible to predict which talks are going to be the most thought provoking, because some people come with seemingly very boring and dry or topics, but they really change your thinking, and they do such a good job presenting and how they bring out the examples. And then on the flip side, we I hate to say it, but when we first started in London, London has many of the big tech companies. I'm thinking here of like the Googles of the world, and Bing and stuff like that. They all have offices there, and so people are like, oh well, let's get someone from these big companies, and they were super boring because usually they weren't the doer. It was kind of the person kind of reading the press release of what had gotten invented in California or whatever. And that was kind of when we switched our model to saying that these companies are super innovative, but unless it's the doer actually coming and talking about it, we don't just want to have someone read a press release. That's not interesting for anyone. So yeah, you never know. You never know where the interesting topics are going to come from, and you never know who's going to do a good job presenting. And that's kind of why we have our format. If we have 5 or 6 talks, and frankly, of the 5 or 6 talks, every time there are some that are amazing, and there are some that are frankly less amazing. But it's the mix.
I wonder if the reason why Geomob is growing the way it has, and it seems to have grown in the last 5-6 months anyway. So you expanded to a few more cities, and things seem to be happening on a more regular basis. I wonder if people aren't recognizing that problem. Okay, if I build it, they won't come. I need to tell someone. I need to be a little bit of a marketer. I need to be a little bit of a speaker. And if my project is going to win, I need to be able to spread the word somehow. So I wonder if something like Geomob is going to be critical in solving some of those problems for these creators out there in the world. And I wonder if we're going to see more of this kind of thing.
Uh, I think so in some ways. I think there's also a lot of value in having a community around you. More and more, one of the trends, especially among startups, is kind of the remote work trend, and it's great for many, many reasons. I mean, speaking for myself as someone who's a parent, I have 2 kids, and it's much easier to structure my life if I can work remotely or work from home. But you definitely do miss that sense of community, and so Geomob helps kind of provide that. We have in all the cities we have like everyone's welcome, and every time we get some new people who come, but we all usually have like a group of regulars who are there as well, who've been coming for a while, and so you do build up that sense of community. And in some cases, it's interesting because some of the people, as in London, where we've been doing it for a long time, people move through the industry at different stages in their career. Sometimes you might be a student, sometimes you might be an employee, sometimes then you maybe start your own thing, maybe then you're working at a big company, and people move through all different roles within the community. So it's interesting then to have that mix of perspectives. But I definitely think there's a value in the physical face-to-face meeting, the social aspect of it.
Yeah, I think that when I hear you talk about it, and describe the community, I can't help but draw a parallel to what's happening in the digital space. So we see the big trends, this idea of curation over creation of data. So the relationships between and among data, between and among services in the online world. And it sounds to me like what you're talking about is these same sort of relationships, but just in the physical world and between people. And that's the thing that's helping to drive the innovation that we see in the geospatial world at the moment.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the pace is definitely picking up, and the new ideas come from those interactions, right? Where person A does something, and then person B sees it and puts a new spin on it, or takes it a step further, or combines it with a different data set, and then the next guy does something on top of that, and of course that can happen in digital communities. But I think one way to accelerate it is also the face-to-face interaction. And so that's one of the goals of what we're kind of aiming for with Geomob.
Okay, so I'm a listener of this podcast, and I'm sitting out there and thinking, this is great. I'm all in. How do I get involved in Geomob? What would I do if I wanted to start my own chapter, if you will, in the city that I live in?
Right. Well, first of all, of course, if you're in one of the cities that we're active in, and that's London, Barcelona, Munich, and Lisbon, you should come along to our events. Second of all, you should check out our website and get on the mailing list. We have a newsletter that we send out once a month where we kind of send updates of the events and also summaries after the events. It's only one email a month, so don't worry, we're not going to spam you or anything like that. But yes, we're definitely on the hunt for other volunteers who want to start Geomob in their city. Over on the website, we'll set up a page where you can kind of see some of the steps. Also, I don't have any. I know it's worked in the cities that I've been in, but there's no kind of rule that Geomob needs to be the same in every city. And there are no hard and fast rules. And maybe in some cities like London, it makes sense to have an event every 2 months because there's so much going on and so many people. Maybe if you're in a smaller city, maybe once or twice a year makes more sense. This is not a slick, polished marketing event. That's not what Geomob is about. Geomob is just about, everyone gathers up, a few people talk about what they're working on, and then we hang out. So as long as you're trying to keep to that type of ethos, please do get in touch. There's contact forms on the website, and we'll definitely look at how we can get it going in your city.
Ed, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to tell us a little bit about what's happening in Geomob, the trends you see in the industry, and letting us know how we can get involved with Geomob if we're interested in that. So thanks so much for coming along today. Much appreciated.
It was my pleasure to be back, and congratulations to you on your on the success of the podcast over the last couple of months. It's in many ways it's very similar to what you're doing by exposing different voices from the community. It's very similar to kind of what we're the Geomob ethos. So it's great.
Cheers, Ed.
Thanks. Bye.
Right at the start of the interview, I mentioned our sponsor, Hive Mapper. That's Hive as in beehive, Mapper. And I mentioned that you can just take video footage, and it could be from a drone, it could be from another aerial platform. I've even seen this being done from people with cell phones in cars, where they upload data to the platform, and they have it automatically converted into 3D geospatial layers. So I think that's really cool in itself, that video footage can be converted and used in this way. But I guess that's only half the story, because that makes some really nice images, really nice pictures. But I didn't mention that you can do a whole bunch of analysis on the platform as well. And one of the features that I think is particularly cool is the height above ground feature. So this is just a sliding bar where I can move it from 0 to whatever your maximum height is, and you can see the colors change throughout the image, showing you the highest points. So if you're used to working with GIS, you'll know that how to do this, and you'll understand the power of this. But I think the truly fascinating thing about this feature and this platform in general is that you only upload video footage. You don't have to have a height model in the background. You don't have to have LiDAR data. This is either there for you, or it's derived from the data that you upload. And there is a whole bunch of use cases for this. And that's it for another episode of the Mapscaping Podcast. My name is Daniel, and I really want to thank all the people that have taken the time to rate and review the show on iTunes. It really means the world to me. And if you have a friend and you think they might enjoy this, please share it with them. I would really appreciate it. As always, you are more than welcome to reach out to me for whatever reason on social media. And to do that, you'll find a few useful links in the show notes. That's it from me. We'll talk again next week. Bye.